So let's start with the next talk. It's a pleasure to have here Dina Demner Fushman to introduce you to Dina. Dina is going to give a talk about question answering for clinical decision support. Dina works at the Lister Hill National Center for Biomedical Communication of the National Library of Medicine of US. And she leads research in the areas of artificial intelligence focused on natural language processing, data mining, and multimodal information retrieval and processing with emphasis on information extraction and textual data analysis, electronic medical records data analysis, and image and text retrieval for clinical decision support and education. Welcome, Dina. Thank you very much for being here, and you can begin.
Thank you. And let me share my screen and find my slides. Okay. And start. So thank you again for inviting me, and it is a pleasure to be here. A little disclaimer, I work for the National Library of Medicine, which is part of the National Institutes of Health and the Human Health Services. So this talk does not reflect the ideas of the US government. It's all my ideas. And a little bit about the National Library of Medicine. Of course, delivering books to medical professionals was established way before 1965, but in its current form, the National Library of Medicine was established by Senators Hill and Kennedy, who realized that when the computers became available, the libraries have to build communication systems to bring the research and the latest findings in medicine to those who practice it, and as they said, to all in need. So who are all and what do they need? These are some examples of the requests that we are getting at the National Library of Medicine. So for our image search engine, we get these requests from the educators to use the pictures from biomedical publications for educational purposes. The patients submit two types of requests. One type is a longer form that they send to the customer services, often asking about some health-related issues. And now, more and more frequently, they type the whole questions into the Medline Plus search box. Medline Plus is the NLM resource for specifically providing information to the public in the form that is better understandable than the professional scientific literature. And of course, the clinicians have questions at the point of service. So the fact that clinicians have questions was noticed by many researchers in medical informatics. Here is an article that Paul Gorman published in 1995, and he states that physicians have many clinical questions, and most of these questions go unanswered. And they then did a very nice study looking at why are these questions going unanswered, and the main conclusion back then was that the information has to be delivered to the point of service when the clinicians need it. Of course, for the researchers, their science also begins with questions, and very often they need that sort of high accuracy information retrieval, the answers that tell them what the state of the art is and whether the idea they have is a new idea. And approximately 10-15 years ago, we started noticing that the public is changing their search for health information. So traditionally, and even if you look at the publications about 15-20 years ago, there are lots of articles that say the patients go to their doctors to ask their health-related questions. But what we're seeing now is that people first turned to the online resources, and then the National Network of Medical Libraries did a study, and they found out that consumers then, when they find something, they don't actually know how to judge whether they found something good or not good. So it is also another task for us to lead them to reliable information. So from the AI and language technology perspective, there's this definition of what a question answering system should do. It should allow a user to ask a question in everyday language and receive an answer quickly and succinctly with sufficient context to validate the answer. So if we look at it from, okay, let's build a system that does that. So taking it into these parts is, first, the system has to understand the question. Then it has to provide a real-time answer. And because there is lots and lots of information on pretty much any topic, the system somehow has to aggregate that information and generate an answer, but also provide some context for the person that is looking at the answer to understand whether the answer is reliable and supported by evidence. So, of course, pretty much everyone has questions related to their health, but today I'm going to talk about just clinicians and consumers, so how we answer clinical questions for clinicians and consumer health questions, and also a little bit about the data and the shared tasks that are available if you're interested in the research in this area and you want to look for some data or challenges. So I will describe these towards the end. So we will start with clinical question answering, and with a very traditional clinical question answering system. Then I will show how that system was tested in a clinical environment. And then very briefly, a different type of questions that are not answered by the literature, but they are about a specific question that the doctor is treating right now, and the answers are in the electronic medical record. So this is jumping a little bit forward. This is a system that is based on the idea that the clinicians know how to ask well-formed questions so that they can get good answers. So you can see on the left the form that provides several slots for asking that question, and the idea was that then given these well-formed questions, the system will actually give the answers. So I will now describe how that is done. So it is a traditional approach to question answering. It's based on a framework for representing knowledge. That is, the main idea is that there is some kind of a typical situation, and there is a template, a frame that will describe that situation, and it will have some specific slots for different aspects of that situation. And then by taking the question frame and aligning it with the answer frame, unifying the frames, we will get the best answer. So looking into the clinical domain, there is such a framework within the evidence-based medicine that stated in the early 90s that the clinicians should not just rely on their education that they got back in medical school, and not even on their continuous medical education. They also need to search for the evidence that is available today in the latest research results, in the latest clinical trials, and of course also take into account the patient's preferences. So they had these three bullets that describe what the physician should do to support their decisions with the latest evidence. Convert information need into a focused question, track down the best evidence with which to answer them, and then identify the bottom line recommendations supporting evidence and its strengths. So the question frame is, I believe it was developed initially for the treatments and maybe diagnosis. These are the everyday tasks. This is our typical situation. When can a clinician have a question while making decisions about the patient's health? When they are choosing how to diagnose something, when they are treating the patients, and in some cases, what could have caused the condition. This is the etiology task. And what is the outlook for the patient after the treatment and down the road? This is the prognosis. And then there was several articles in the Journal of American Medical Association that were teaching clinicians asking these well-formed questions that have to have some answers in the current literature. So the question has to describe the patient and the problem. And in our case, the question is how much better is amiodarone in controlling fast atrial fibrillation with rapid ventricular response compared to cardizem. So the patient is not exactly described. We don't know the age of the patient or anything else about the patient, but the problem is stated very specifically. It is the atrial fibrillation. And then the two drugs that the physician is considered are listed, and we know that what the clinician wants to achieve is the rate control. So this is how they were taught to populate that PICO frame and then use that frame to look for the answers. And in most cases, I would say for all simple questions and for some of the complex questions, the frames work perfectly fine. We found that for complex questions, the fine-grained relations are not captured in these frames, and also the temporal relations and some other. So these frames are really good as an initial approach, but we know that they will not answer all questions or capture rather all questions. But to populate that frame automatically, we need some kind of a source of knowledge to know in that question what is the problem and what are the interventions. Luckily, in the biomedical domain, we have this unified medical language system that is supported by the National Library of Medicine, and it is organized around these biomedical concepts. You see here, we are focused on the concept of atrial fibrillation with rapid ventricular response, and you can see that the semantic type of that term is disease or syndrome. So we know it is a problem, and we can automatically recognize that problem in the question and put it into the appropriate slot of the frame. And then the same goes for the interventions. The drugs will be marked as such in the UMLS, and also some of the outcomes. So we can now center our system on that knowledge source and use the evidence-based medicine framework to build that pipeline that will hopefully give us the good answers in real time and with sufficient support for the patient or for the clinician to drill down to the raw evidence that is presented in the literature. So given that question frame that we can now build, we can also use the recommendations for searching the evidence and search the PubMed Medline for the answers. And then in the same way we extracted the knowledge from the question, we can extract that situation, that frame from the answers. So what is the article talking about? What is the main problem that they are solving? What interventions are they using? And what did they find are the outcomes? What is the bottom line advice in that article? And then we can align these frames with the question frame. So the most complex part in all of that article processing is this answer bottom line extraction. If you just look at not at the full text of the article, but just at the abstract of the article, and if you look at the last 3 lines, very often this is enough to get a good answer, but not always. So we built several classifiers and a meta classifier to rank every sentence in the abstract and then take the top 3 scoring sentences above the threshold to be the bottom line extracted from that specific article. And then, as I said, we align these answer frames with the question frames. And in addition to the frame match, we also take into account the strength of evidence in that article. Was that a randomized clinical trial, or maybe it was just observed in animals? Also, the recency of the publication. And what we found out is that the true unification where the frames match exactly is not really possible, because almost never every slot will be filled by the same terminal instances in the published literature as we have in our question. So we have this fuzzy unification where the frames absolutely have to agree on the problem that is being discussed. This is a firm constraint, but then all the other parts of the frame are softer, and then the frame with the highest score is the best answer. So given that we had that system and it was actually real time, we demonstrated it at the NIH Clinical Center, and they said, well, this is exactly what we need to support our interdisciplinary team's decisions, because they have to be based on the evidence-based practice. So we had this agreement that the information from the notes, from the patient's progress notes, will be extracted from their electronic health record and sent to us. Our condition on the NLM side was that the information will be already de-identified. We will not know who the patient is or anything else that can identify the patient. And then we also got from the interdisciplinary team the resources that they wanted transmitted back to them. And this is what we did. We formatted the answers that they wanted, and we showed it in their evidence-based practice tab in their electronic health record. And you can see here that the note now has the specific terms highlighted. Because it's the NIH Clinical Center, the patients might have some rare diseases that the team did not see before, so they wanted some definitions. So if they clicked on these highlighted terms, they could get the definition from the OMS of what that is. They could see the patient's medications, and also at the bottom, you can see that they are now seeing these bottom line. The articles are ranked by the strength of their relevance, and they can see the bottom line advice extracted from the articles. And, you know, we believed that we solved the problem of bringing the evidence to the point of care. But then when we had some years later, that application was running at the clinical center for 10 years, and it was a very stable use. It was not going up and it was not going down. And when we asked why it's not being used more often, the answer was that it turns out looking at these individual answers and figuring out how to combine them still will take too much time at the point of service, and the clinicians just don't have that time. So instead of having several answers, the system really needs to provide that one comprehensive answer. And the physicians also have to be absolutely sure that the answer they're getting is good and is supported by good evidence. But again, they do not have time to go and check if it's the case. So that sort of leaves us with that we need to work more on our complex question understanding and our answer summarization, answer generation. Switching gears to a different source of answers for clinicians, they might have a question about some patient's measurements at the point of service to make a decision, keep the medication or maybe switch a patient to some other medication or have a procedure. And if you look at all these different screens, they do have that information, but it's very hard to even keep in their minds where that information might be stored in the chart, and also then find exactly the measurements they need. So Kirk Roberts, who was a postdoctoral fellow at the time, decided he wants to automate that process and convert these information needs to some format that can then be answered by the electronic health record. So we started with the first order logic and lambda calculus. And our first experiment was just to see if that will be enough to encode the questions asked by clinicians. And it turns out that it was sufficient to do that. Then Kirk went on and actually applied semantic parsing and has shown that he can convert these questions with the help of that semantic parser into something that using FHIR, the EHR can answer provided you pointed in the right direction. So that was a very satisfactory result. So now we are switching to consumer health question answering. And this is really important because, as I mentioned before, the consumers are turning to online resources first to make their decisions. And sometimes they might have some harmful information or not find good information online. So before we discuss the system, I would like to walk us through the example of a consumer question. And you will see that this question is definitely not well formed. And even if we have a hope to teach physicians how to ask well-formed questions, I don't think we can teach the whole population ask the questions in the right form. We might not have the background to ask the right questions. So here is the question that was submitted to Medline Plus search box. I have a hydroxys pill with H and 5O2 on one side and white on reverse. Can I take that pill with a Benadryl? So first, our system has to figure out what that description of the pill is and how to link it to a drug name. And right now we don't have a system that can do that. So I actually did a manual search, actually several searches till I finally figured out that this is hydroxyzine hydrochloride 50 milligrams. But then the other part of the question is, can I take that pill with a Benadryl? So first, that pill, we need a system to resolve that to that hydroxyzine pill, which we do. We have developed a system because we have seen a lot of core reference in the consumer's questions. And then also lots and lots of misspellings. So we also have a system to convert Benadryl to its correct spelling. So now you can see that the question actually was, can I take hydroxyzine with Benadryl? Now, If in some cases the system can just look for information about these two drugs and provide information about these two drugs, so it's not enough to know what the entities are in the question. It's also important to know what is the task at hand, what is the question type. And in this case here, the type is the potential interactions between these two drugs or complications caused by taking these drugs together. And we have to search specifically for that interaction of these two drugs. We can't just provide information about the drugs separately. Now, even if I searched manually for interactions between these two drugs, and I couldn't find any resources on that. But then I realized that both of these drugs are antihistamines. So I just modified the search saying, is it safe to mix antihistamines? And in that case, we get the answer to that says, no, it's not a good idea. So here you can see that the expected answer type was no, but to provide support and evidence, we also need to then backtrack through all the steps that I just discussed and tell the patient that these two drugs are antihistamines and you shouldn't be taking these the two antihistamines together for the following reasons. So this is the system that we want to have, but we are not there yet. But what we have noticed in the process of going over that question is that we sort of summarized the question. And that was the finding that we accidentally discovered when we had the live QA shared task with track 2017, where the National Institute of Standards assessors were summarizing the question. They were judging the answers returned by the systems. And we provided the gold standard answers so that they can compare the answers given by the systems to the gold standard. But in addition to that, because they wanted to be sure that they understand the question, they actually summarized and paraphrased the original patient's questions. So you can see here that they took that long question and said, and converted it to, how do I find out if my fibromyalgia is genetic? And then we decided, what if we apply that, frame extraction that I described earlier to these shorter questions? And of course, it turned out that it is much simpler to do that, and that we get much better results when we summarize the questions first and then extract the question focus and type. So we went on to see if with the new technology, with the transformers, we still need that knowledge, to know the focus and type. And Shweta Yadav, who just transitioned to her tenure track position at the University of Chicago, found out that yes, when we add the knowledge of what the focus, what the main entity in the question is, and what kind of information about the entity are they looking for, we call it the question type, it significantly improves the results. Another observation that we had was that if NIH has lots of good answers specifically for the patients, but the questions are not necessarily in the form that the patients or our frames are representing the questions. So what if we use question entailment, and then when the questions are aligned, we can just get a perfect answer? And in that case, we actually know that the answer is comprehensive and reliable and based on the latest evidence, so we can just provide that answer as is. So taking all of that, we are now building a prototype system that has a lot going on. pulling from all kinds of reliable sources. We have not addressed the automating the proofs of the reliability of the sources and the answers yet. So we are, the alternative to that is to use only the reliable sources, which we do for now. And we are focusing on processing the question correctly, extracting all these entities, building these frames, building the searches, and then getting the answers, combining these perfect answers from the NIH resources through question entailment with the answers that we got through the traditional information retrieval pipeline. So you might remember that I said giving a list of answers is not really what people want. We really want to give them one comprehensive answer. So we looked a little bit at conditional answer summarization given the question. We built a collection for that, and all the collections that I am describing are publicly available and could be used in building and testing the systems. So in this case, we actually took the answers provided by that Chica system, and we summarized the individual answers, make them shorter, and we also took these all of these answers and did a multi-document summary of and provided one comprehensive answer. And then we explored some baseline approaches that actually show that when the system is also given the question, it produces a much better summary of the answer. We then also moved on to see if we can use these systems that was some experimental result on the collection that we prepared manually. What if we just use the collection that we prepared manually as a test set and train on the publicly available resources? So we took the Cochrane reviews that have plain language summaries, and we used the original reviews as the source documents for the summaries. And we did the same for the plain language summaries in PubMed, for Medline Plus topics and other resources. And then we used our collection that I presented in the previous slide as a test set. Now, what approaches would work? Travis Goodwin and Max Savory explored 21 different tasks to fine-tune the system, and they also used different models, Pegasus, BART, and T5, and they saw that when you do a zero shot, you have no fine-tuning on the specific summaries that we prepared. You can see the differences in the systems, but with very few learning examples, as few as 10, the differences between the systems were not significant, but the summaries were also not a good quality that we can give to the patients right away. So there is a lot of work in this area as well. And now I'm going to switch to the shared tasks and data that is available for these tasks. So first, a very important task of getting the reliable answers. That was a survey from CDC early on in May 2020 that really surprised me. And they were looking specifically at whether the people know that the household cleaning and disinfectants for COVID-19 prevention could not be used internally. And it turned out that the majority of people actually did not know that these substances are harmful. So this is really, I think, a good proof that we need to know that the answers we are providing are reliable. But how do we know it? There are many online sources that look reasonable, but might not be supported by any scientific evidence. So what we did, we collected online claims, and then we went to search the medical literature to see if these claims are supported by the literature or refuted, or there is no evidence in the literature at all. And we used the track COVID and track misinformation questions, submitted these as queries to Bing, then extracted the claims and extracted the abstracts from PubMed, and then in the abstracts we annotated sentences as support or refuting the claim that we created. So these are real-life claims, and these are the support that comes from the scientific literature. When we analyzed, there are of course other collections for claim veracity and trustworthiness, and they are listed here in the graph. And when we compared our claims that we collected from the web with those that were created for these other collections, it turned out that our claims are much more complex. And then when we looked at how using our collection in figuring out whether the claim is correct or refuted by the literature, if you use our collection combined with these other collections, you get much better results. So this is, again, a still very much open area of research, and we need much better approaches and probably more collections to support and refute the claims. I'm now switching to that other question that we have. Do we need systems for all these different stakeholders? If you remember in the first slide, we looked, there were clinicians, researchers, patients, administrators, and other people involved in healthcare. So do we need a separate system for each one of those, or will one system be capable of figuring out who is asking the question and how to answer it? So that question was posed within the Text Analysis Conference Epidemic Question Answering track, and it was built as a traditional question answering evaluation. The systems retrieved answers for clinicians and patients, and then the assessors created answer keys looking at these answers, and then they went back to the answers and annotated the answers with those as containing those keys or not. We had a fairly good participation. We had 2 rounds of the evaluation. In the first round, because there were no training data for that task, people were basically building the training set for themselves. And then in the second round of the evaluation, they could use that training set to train their systems. And it turned out that the 2 teams that performed really well, coming in practically one system, the University of Texas participated in both rounds, but the University of Waterloo participated only in the second round with the system that they already had for other tasks, for other question answering tasks. And it turned out that their performance kind of swapped. They did not perform, one team performed better for consumers and the other team performed better for the clinicians, and these were 2 different systems. But hopefully we can combine these results in the future so that we don't build separate systems for every type of question answering task. So the observations on the task were that the answers, as expected, were very different. The answer keys were very different for the professionals and for the consumers. Different passages were selected as answers for consumers and for the experts. And the task is challenging, but the results were actually good. Some of the answers were just really wonderful. And of course, we are very grateful to the people who judged the results. Now switching to other challenges and other types of question answering. In many cases, the text is really not enough, and we need to bring other modalities into that question answering process. And we have multimodal question answering. One such case, of course, is the supporting the decisions for the radiologists. And this is a real problem because radiologists have a huge workload, and a system that could ask an intelligent question or point them to some abnormality in the image will be very helpful. So here we started with asking questions about basically what is wrong in this picture, if anything. And we had several challenges. I believe they are ongoing. The visual question answering task that is envisioned as support for students who are studying radiology, but also for the clinicians, for radiologists. Another interesting task, this one geared towards consumers, is video question answering. And the situations where we feel this is the text is not enough is in some emergency situations, for example, how to stop bleeding, or if someone, say, wants to do a self-diagnosis, reading a text that explains how to do it might not help, but seeing how someone is showing it will be helpful. So that's why we started that medical video question answering challenge that had some good results last year, but it's also definitely not a solved problem, and we hope that it will take place this year within the text retrieval conference video challenge. So to summarize, question answering systems should support health-related decisions, and we very often hear now that, the systems are so good that these zero-shot systems can already do all that answering, which is not quite the case yet, as I've shown with our results. But the near zero-shot systems do show promise, and we should work more on these. And determining if the answer is reliable and comprehensive is still a challenge. So in the future, I think we should work more on exploring different stakeholders and their needs, the truthfulness of information, and the value added by that knowledge, like the question, focus, and type. But I'm sure there's some other knowledge that will be very helpful in improving the systems. And how much training data do we actually need for good few-shot performance? And the perennial question that we get from all reviewers: you're using all these evaluation metrics, but how do you know if these evaluation metrics are any good? So there are no metrics right now that everyone agrees are exactly the same as a human will judge it. But time and again, Rouge comes up as correlating really well with human judgments. So thank you very much for your invitation and for listening to me, and I hope you have questions.
Thank you very much, Dina, for your very interesting talk. While we wait to see if there are some questions, because there's a lag with the platforms we are transmitting through. I have some questions to ask you. For me, it was really interesting. I didn't know about those challenges. It's a lot of work to organize those challenges, and when there's not that much information, for example, for the epidemics challenge. I have some questions, for example, about the risk of obtaining incorrect answers for the physicians and also for the consumers. Like if you study which are the risks. Yesterday we had a panel of regulations on artificial intelligence and what, well, the effects of having problems with artificial intelligence. In this case that you mentioned of a patient asking if he could take 2 pills. If the answer is wrong, it could be very dangerous, and who is responsible for that?
Right. And of course, you know, there will be all kinds of disclaimers, as we have now, even for the information that they find in Medline Plus, that this is just information. But yes, so there is a lot of work. So we did some work in trying to figure out why the system, say, predicts that the patient will get worse using clinical notes. And if you look at the model itself, very often it's still not clear, and that's why the clinicians are so reluctant to trust the model, because the model might not necessarily explain well why it's making the prediction. So Travis Goodwin looked into using TCAV with sort of known, you know, if a patient is having, say, that kind of like heart problem, what will the clinician focus on? Because there are all kinds of guidelines for clinicians to check this, that, and the other. So can we look at the model using some different models from the outside? Can we look at whether the model is actually focusing on the right things? Because of course you all know that example where the model was very good at predicting some radiology diagnosis, but turned out it was focusing on the differences in the 2 systems that we used and produced slightly different pictures to show the results rather than on the pathology in the image. So to avoid that, we need to work more on these systems that explain why the model came up with that answer.
Great, thank you. There's a question asking if physicians trust the answers provided by the systems. You sort of mentioned something about that, but it has to do with explainability, I think, but.
Right. So you know, sometimes if they're looking to confirm their knowledge and the system comes up with the answer that they know is true, they trust the system. But generally they would trust the other clinician at hand more, or they will look up, there are these resources like UpToDate that is compiled by physicians. So the problem with all these resources that we particularly saw during COVID, right? The knowledge is changing so fast that these carefully handcrafted resources don't catch up with the and they don't use preprints, right? They will not use something that is published ahead of print. So the systems should be able to, you know, judge whether what they are extracting is strong enough. And, you know, we hopefully can convey how we judge whether the evidence is strong enough to the systems. So in my case, when I was ranking the articles on the strengths of evidence, I was looking at how many patients were involved in the trial, what statistics, what endpoints did they use, when was this published. Of course, when we compile one answer, it will be also to for the system to know if something is controversial, like you have this answer and that other answer that contradicts your first answer. So presenting that with also with this support that there was a randomized clinical trial on 10,000 patients that said X, then hopefully the physicians will trust that.
Hopefully, they will. There's, I also have another question about the identification. You shortly mentioned the identification. What about that? For example, could be the case that some answers are not identified and that pose some risk to the patients, or the information is made public that it shouldn't? Or
right. So yeah, if we work with clinical data, if we base our answers for some, and that will be again one of the sort of looking forward dreams, if we could use the raw data in the electronic medical records and find a patient like this one to support the decision with, the patient had with that same sort of, course of disease, had that outcome when given this treatment, that will be fantastic, particularly for some rare cases where there are no clinical trials. But yes, there will be a danger of re-identifying the patient. But, my favorite and unfortunately only example is that MIMIC3 database, where it is publicly available to reasonable people, and so far, hopefully nothing bad happened to any of these patients.
Yeah. That's good. Thanks for the example. And what would you say would be the challenges of doing question answering the same thing you're doing in another language, not in English? Thinking, for example, in Spanish, that's also a language that's widely spoken.
Right. And there are actually very good resources being developed for Spanish. There is the BioAsk ASQ challenge. And last year, they actually had a challenge. One of the tasks was in Spanish. So there is a very strong group in Barcelona that is developing these challenges and resources for Spanish. Of course, there is some of the vocabularies that go into the UMLS are Spanish as well. So there's that. So I would say Spanish is not a poor resource language anymore.
No, I know, but I meant the difficulties of thinking of doing that for another language. That is, it's not exactly the same than doing it for English, but yes, for Spanish, there's being a lot developed right now.
Right. And there are all these multilingual models nowadays that are doing much better. And there is that hope that in that sort of, multilingual space, you can grab some knowledge from some other places and translate it to whatever language you need.
Thank you. Well, Gerardo, have you seen any more questions?
No, we have no more questions from online.
So, well, thank you very much, Dina, for your very interesting talk and for your answers. We are very pleased to have you here. And
thank you.
We will
wait, we just had one more question. Sorry. What would contribute more to improve the state of the art, improving models or improving data resources to train and evaluate models?
Reminds me of a question we asked when we were developing that image retrieval system. We asked our board of scientific counselors, should we focus more on research or on making it publicly available and real time? And the answer was both. So yes, I think it just goes hand in hand. You can't develop a good system without data. So you absolutely need data. But yeah, if we only have data without the systems, yeah, there's no progress. And the evaluation metrics are really coming into focus right now, because we are now working on making that scientific literature that might only contain the answers that are true, accessible at the patient level. And this is a sort of translation, simplification type of task. And we proposed it as a challenge. We have the translations, but the bottleneck was the evaluation metric. And how will you know if the systems are actually doing a good job on simplifying? So, and of course, there is SARI, and there is Rouge, and there is Rouge against multiple references, but there is still some doubts on what will we learn without good evaluation metrics, and will the collection be useful after the fact, after the challenge.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting, because there's not many available data, and it's very difficult to build the data, and not very rewarding, because if you don't have the systems and only have the data, as you mentioned, you can't do anything. And yeah, it's difficult to build the data and not to be able to publish it, also because of anonymity reasons.
Right. If you cannot publish your data set, this is really, you're doing a lot of work for. So that's why I'm always, and of course this is just for English, but I'm always telling the students who are working on their PhDs to use mimic data as well, because you can actually contribute your annotations back to mimic. And then at least you can compare then your internal data with the mimic data, saying, yes, I got the same result, or no, I did not get the same result, and then look some more into why you got some different results.
Right. Well, thank you, Nan, for your question. Thank you, Dina, for your answer.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yes, we are closing now. Thank you very much.